Hello, Professor. Welcome to my final. For this, I'm going to be combining Podofkin, boundary, and color theory all together. So to start off, to summarize Podofkin's theories, Podofkin was a Russian theorist whose ideas we still use today, and he was one of the earliest ones that we talked about back in the film language unit. He was all about montage, and unlike Eisenstein, he viewed montage as a way to connect ideas. So he viewed editing as a compulsory and deliberate guidance of a viewer's thoughts and psychology. And he used a lot of nature imagery for this because color was not available at the time. But now, with this theory, this new and improved, evolved version of what I'm going to be talking about, we will be incorporating color. So he also had 5 main points. These are his 5 methods that are his main points in his theory. I found this online through my personal research. We didn't talk about it in class, at least I don't have notes of it. So this is my source, and I did simplify it because there's kind of a lot of words there. So this is a more in-depth explanation straight from the source of his 5 points. Right here, I just summarized them. So first we have contrast, and essentially by that, he just means juxtaposing opposing scenes to highlight differences. Next, we have parallelism, which is showing 2 separate events simultaneously to draw conclusions or connections. This one we see a lot today. Next is symbolism, which is also used very often, and that is using imagery to suggest abstract ideas or emotions. Pretty self-explanatory. Next is simultaneity, which is interweaving events happening at the same time for suspense or thematic unity. And then last, we have leitmotif, which is repeating specific elements like an image or sound to reinforce the theme. So to quickly sum up Podofkin's ideas, he viewed film as an art form separate from theater, completely unique, and he thought montage was the essence of filmmaking. He used relational editing to connect psychological ideas and guide the viewer, and he also thought that films should engage viewers intellectually and emotionally, and that viewers should be able to interpret shots on their own. I'm going through this pretty quickly because I have a lot to cover. So next up is Boundary. One film that excellently utilizes Podofkin's theories is Requiem for a Dream, because there's a lot of montages. Honestly, the whole film, it just feels like one massive montage. There's a lot of montages and like parallel editing to juxtapose the 4 stories that we're following of Marion, Tyrone, Sarah, and Harry. And it also guides us to the conclusion, not so subtly, honestly, but the use of editing in this film is very heavy. There's a lot of cuts, a lot of sharp edits, and it guides us all to the consensus that drugs are bad. And the film's use of editing really highlights the despair that they're all feeling together. Even though they're all living different lives and they have different struggles, all of them are feeling the effects of drug addiction, and the editing in the film really helps to create meaning and emotional intensity and just illustrate the detrimental effect that the drug abuse has. And the rhythmic sequences of all the cuts and montages also really helps to illustrate the psychological effects of drug abuse. So that is just a quick rundown of Podofkin's theories. I'm moving pretty quick because there's a lot to cover. Next, I'm going to quickly explain Boundary. From what we talked about in class, he's the sausage king. Very Marxist, very against capitalism, and he viewed film as just a method for propaganda. So I'm only going to be using a small bit of his theories because I want to focus less on his ideas of film being a medium for propaganda and more so on the less biased part. So, from what we talked about in class, Boundary is all about the film cinematic apparatus, which is enveloping viewers into the world of film and really just immersing oneself in that. For him, he viewed that as bad because that's just like, he viewed it as brainwashing. Like, you just align your views with whatever you're watching, and you just allow the film to formulate ideas on things for you. So he was all about the apparatus, and so I'm going to focus more on that than his ideas about it being propaganda. I found this little snippet from this website of someone analyzing this through the boundary theory. So this is just a quick kind of definition how I'm going to be utilizing Boundry's ideas. So it says, Jean-Louis Boundry's apparatus theory suggests that movie viewers experience an immobility that makes watching a film akin to dreaming. Spectators are unable to freely move, unable to affect what they see, and unable to differentiate between self and other, as well as the ideologies of a film and their own thoughts. So this is why Boundary viewed film as propaganda, because he just thought it was a brainwashing machine. So the only thing I'm going to be taking from Boundary is the apparatus part of it, which is immersing oneself in the movie and the ways that a film might utilize editing, color, and other tools to really bring the viewer in and create a world within the film for the viewer to experience with the characters. Once again, I'm going to be using Requiem for a Dream to quickly illustrate Boundry's ideas in action. So the way this works for this film is it very much creates an immersive world for the viewer between the editing, the constant music. It heightens our anxiety along with the actors. And also, Boundary was very heavy on ideology. Requiem for a Dream utilizes that in an interesting way because it gives the audience kind of an outside perspective to this. Because in the film, all of the characters view drugs ideally as a way for escape, as a way to fix a problem of excessive weight or stress. They view drugs as an ideological thing, and they really glamorize it. For the viewer, we see that, and then we see the effects of that, and so at the end, it's like drugs are bad. That's the message. However, the characters align with Boundary because, in a sense, they're almost brainwashed that drugs are a good thing and a fun thing and a thing to play around with. Luckily, the film does not allow that for the viewer, but Requiem for a Dream is a great example of how a film can create an apparatus, a world for the viewer to fall into and to experience with the characters, and also it is a great example of ideology in film. Particularly this shot where the camera is strapped onto Jennifer Connelly, and also I'm pretty sure there's a part where it's strapped onto the mother as well. But these angles really take us into the mind of the character and help us feel the anxiety along with them. And in addition to that, just all of the cuts and all of the montage sequences, this film just really grabs the viewer and takes them along for the ride and helps you feel the anxiety and the horror along with the characters. So, very quick, brief summary of Boundry's ideas. He thought film strictly represented ideology, particularly with capitalism, because he was a Marxist. He thought it was a tool to introduce propaganda to viewers and brainwash people to sausage, to just consume. He thought viewers were passive consumers, and he thought when people watch movies, they kind of just associate with the characters and forget their own ideas, and just take on the ideas of the people in the film. And beyond that, he also had his apparatus theory, which kind of goes along with viewers associating with the characters because it's how the viewers immerse themselves in the movie. Apparatus theory envelops the viewer. It's kind of like a dream, and the viewers get to experience everything that the characters are experiencing with them. Okay, so now that I've shown that I know and understand the theories pretty well, I'm going to get into my new idea that builds off of those two. So first off, marrying the two theories together, Pudovkin is all about the montage. He has his 5 main points of how montage can be utilized to shape a viewer's psychology. Boundary is all about ideology and apparatus, and how the cinema uses different tools, different factors to immerse viewers and convey hidden ideologies, propaganda, do a little bit of brainwashing. But I'm steering away from the biased part of that. And then on top of building those two on top of each other together, I'm also throwing color theory into the mix and expanding that to another level as well. So the way that my idea differs from the original Pudovkin and Boundary is I'm taking editing, ideology, and color, combining it all into one approach, and building off of their ideas with color as the main focus and how that affects the way that we react psychologically and the way that we are guided through a film, and also how it affects our own ideologies, which connects the two together. So I'm going to go through my bullet points and elaborate on this, and then at the end I'm going to analyze Parasite, the 2019 film, and a little bit of the 2021 film Cruella as well through this theory. I'm also going to be reading off my notes a little bit. So there are going to be 6 main core concepts to this. The first one is the chromatic apparatus. So this is going to be looking at how color functions as a psychological and an ideological tool. And that is to say that color becomes a key part of that apparatus in maintaining the illusion of naturalness while also reinforcing and conveying more symbolic meanings underneath that align with the ideological narratives that associates more with boundary. And that can be accomplished through color palettes, lighting choices, and color grading to immerse the viewer in a visually constructed reality in an attempt to convey ideals. Next principle is emotional montage, which is more so building off of Pudovkin's theories, which illustrates how montage can shape and guide emotional meaning and interpretation through the juxtaposition of different shots to create new meanings. So by incorporating color theory into this, we can see how different color compositions can contribute to the narrative and also to the viewer's emotional response. And seeing this in action, for example, warmer hues like reds or oranges signify passion or conflict, and then cutting straight to cool tones shifts it to be more of a calm and almost alienated vibe instead. Okay, next up is going to be ideological color coding. This is definitely going to be seen in Parasite once I get to analyzing that later. So we are borrowing from Boundry's ideological ideas again, and seeing how color symbolism can play a role in either reinforcing or challenging what might be perceived as the dominant ideology depicted in the film. So essentially what I'm saying is there might be ideological meanings embedded or associated with a color, and the filmmaker can manipulate the viewer's unconscious association by utilizing and strategically placing that color within the scene. Next, we're going to be looking at active and passive engagement of the viewers through color montage. And this actually kind of bridges the two opposing standpoints from Pudovkin, that viewers should be engaged and actively seeking interpretation through montage, and Boundary thinking that audiences are just passive spectators just consuming the sausage. So this combines those two because colors can be used to do both of those things. And what I mean by that is repetitive color motifs, or like Pudovkin's idea of leitmotif. They can create a subconscious familiarity with certain emotions or ideas, which promotes a passive absorption of the narrative, while sudden color shifts actually can do the opposite. So Deliberately contrasting colors can provoke more active intellectual engagement, and it can also challenge the viewer to interpret the relationship between the shots and their symbolic meanings. So that associates more with Pudovkin. Repeating color motifs kind of associates with both Pudovkin and Bowdry, because it encourages the idea that spectators can be passive, but it also incorporates Pudovkin's idea of leitmotif. This also ties into Pudovkin's idea of parallelism and contrast. It's essentially the same thing, but looking at it through the lens of color. So parallelism would be like the repeating motif, like if red is associated with a certain person, like in Into the Spider-Verse, red and blue is heavily associated with Miles Morales. And so anytime you see him, he's usually wearing red, or there's red somewhere in the scene. So that's like an example of parallelism and also leitmotif, whereas contrast, it heightens the emotional tension. And you can do that with color by juxtaposing, say, like a nice welcoming sunset with like a cold city landscape. So put simply, these are some of the key points of my theory. First, we have the chromatic illusion, which is that cinema uses color as an essential part of the apparatus, creating an emotional and ideological illusion of reality. So essentially just saying that color is a tool that is used to immerse people in the film more thoroughly. And then 2 and 3 kind of go together. Montage's meaning, editing, and juxtaposition is enhanced by color theory and construct deeper emotional and intellectual interpretations. And then along with that, the emotional engagement, how color amplifies the psychological and emotional effects of montage, encouraging identification or critical reflection. So essentially just saying how color theory can really enhance montages and editing and make it more deliberate and evoke more of a tailored response from the audience. Next is ideological subversion, which is the deliberate use of color, how it can either reinforce or challenge dominant ideologies. And then last is viewer activation, which is that while color can often reinforce passivity, its use in experimental or disruptive montage sequence can also provoke active interpretation. So essentially saying color can either be used to pacify the audience or engage the audience. Okay, so now we are analyzing Parasite through this new introduced theory. So first off, the chromatic illusion, color as an ideological reinforcement. So throughout the film, it's very evident how different of lifestyles the Kims have versus the Parks. The Parks are the rich ones that employ the Kims throughout the movie without knowing they're all related. So the Parks home is just the epitome of wealth. It's large, it's got so much natural light, it's always lit warmly. There's a lot of earthy tones and beige and just lots of signifiers of wealth and order and privilege. Whereas the Kim's home in the basement is always very dim, very desaturated, and it's just depicted in lots of muted tones. Grays and browns, always dim light, and that is to convey their confined and impoverished existence. That also goes for the basement of the Parks home, where the housekeeper and her husband live. Down there, it's very dark, it's a sickly green, and that very much illustrates the sickness of her husband, who is just hanging out down there without anyone knowing. So the chromatic apparatus of Parasite very much reinforces the stark class divide between the Kims, the poor family, and the Parks, the wealthy family, as well as the housekeeper and her husband. And what's also interesting about that is the seamless presentation of the divide of these classes and these spaces. It kind of gives the illusion of a natural division, which very much also reinforces and aligns with Bowdry's ideas of
the cinematic apparatus subtly reinforcing ideological messages and promoting things subconsciously and just feeding the viewer the sausage. An interesting note to highlight the way that in the beginning of Parasite the class difference is naturalized is the use of the color orange, because although orange is a warm, inviting color, it's used to represent both families, but it has very different context for both of them. When it's used for the Parks, it's a light, warm, inviting color, like we see in the youngest son's bedroom in that clip I showed. Whereas with the Kims, it's kind of a sickly orange. And I found that specifically from this source here, the actual director himself used the word neurosis to describe the interchangeableness of this color that is used throughout the film. So it's kind of used to convey an overall unnerving vibration and imbalance when it's used in the context of the Kims, and it's also meant to underline the distress caused by the dysfunctional nature of capitalism, a deficit in functioning where the system keeps making the rich richer and the poor poorer in an abhorrent entanglement of parasitic relationships. So that's just one example of how Parasite initially tries to naturalize the class differences before then illustrating how stark and unhealthy the difference is. The second point that I talked about, which is emotional montage, in other words, editing and color juxtaposition, is very evident in this film because the director, Bong Joon-ho, I don't know how to say that, but the director uses montage on multiple occasions in the film to really juxtapose the Kims and the Parks and construct an emotional and intellectual meaning. And some noticeable sequences of this are when the Parks are plotting how to get their mother employed. In other words, when they're plotting to poison the housekeeper with peach fuzz. So in this sequence, I'm actually going to show it. It switches between the Kims plotting it in their dark, dim home basement space and the father carrying it out in the nice, open, warm house of the Parks. What's interesting too in this scene is noticing the contrast between when they're first talking about it and when they actually begin to carry out the plan. Right now, the colors are very warm. Even the peach itself is red, which is kind of a danger allergy color. And now when he's carrying out the plan, the color palette completely shifts, it's cold, and that's kind of to illustrate the calculations of their plan. Now, I've skipped forward a little bit to illustrate the contrast between the wealth that they are in when they are with the Parks and the dim, claustrophobic, muted colors of their own apartment. So here we see the bright natural light, the greenery behind him, as they're carrying out the plan, versus the cramped, dull colors in their own apartment. And this will be more evident when they actually get to the Park's house. So now we're in their house, we see how warm and bright it is there. We see this just contrasted back here in their own apartment. There is no natural light. It is completely artificial. It's dark in there. They're all sitting on the floor. It's completely cramped. And it's very evident to see the class divide. The third point is ideological color coding. So color coding class and power. As I kind of already stated before, the Parks get warmth and also a lot of green. They are typically associated with a lot of nature, and this is evident in their manicured lawn, and they're just, anytime they're outside, it is green outside. Or even just now when we saw them driving in the car,
as the father is driving with Mrs. Park, there's green all around them. Whereas most of the time when the Kims are outside, it's either dark and raining or they're in the dingy city. So a lot of grays and browns and neutral tones are associated with the Kims, and that kind of illustrates the feeling of how trapped they are and just their struggle for survival. So the parks get greenery, natural lighting, lots of warmth to symbolize their artificial luxury and also kind of just their detachment from reality. They're just in their own little bubble. And then the Kims are always, when they're not with the parks, dirty, dark, and just trapped and cramped and dingy. And then red is also a common theme when things are getting violent. It's pretty self-explanatory. The peach is red, blood is red. So by coding the characters and spaces with these colors, Parasite makes its ideological pinpoints pretty clear, and they help it to further resonate on a deeper level with the audience, who is rich and living in luxury, and who is living at the bottom of the ladder. So next, number 4, active and passive engagement through color montage. So most of it in the beginning and right up until the last 30 minutes or so is passive spectatorship. The way the Parasite is crafted and colored makes the difference between the higher class and the lower class seem pretty seamless, because the seamless editing really immerses the viewer, and the transition from the park's bright warm home to the Kim's dark cramped home is just very effortless, which really reinforces the ideological division. However, once the bunker is discovered underneath the park's home, this passive flow is completely disrupted, because while at first the tonal shifts were pretty natural, once we get to the basement and it's all just sickly greens and grays and darkness, it heavily contrasts with the park's home. And this really incorporates more active engagement as the lighting and the color palette completely shifts, and it really forces the viewers to confront the hidden layers of the inequality. And also, once the bloody climax comes, it is even more contrasted, because we see the warm birthday party for their youngest son and all of the happy festivities that are happening, while down beneath it's completely cold and chaotic and just violent. And it's kind of designed to just make the viewer question how fragile the illusion of harmony is between both classes, at least in Korea. So lastly, parallelism and contrast. It goes along pretty strongly with active and passive viewing, and active and passive correlations with color and how they're attached to characters and spaces in a movie. So just again, parallelism is employed to illustrate the warmth and luxury and bright natural colors of the park's home. And this is consistently seen throughout the whole movie, even right up until the end when everyone's getting slaughtered, because the parks are never seen down in the bunker or at the Kim's house, and so they're always in a bright, open space and always associated with that feeling of luxury, whereas the Kims are associated with more dark things, more secrecy. Even when the parks come home, the Kims are stuffed under the table, hiding in the darkness under there, while the parks are roaming around their living room completely unaware. And in the flood scene, the Kims are in their dark home trying to salvage what they can. The streets are dark and wet, and there's just messes everywhere, which is also a great metaphor for how their life is about to come crumbling down. So in this respect, color kind of acts as a psychological bridge, because it helps the viewers to identify with the Kim's struggles with the drab color palette of their home, and it just really mirrors the trapped feeling that they feel. It's interesting to see how initially the film really naturalizes the class difference between the Parks and the Kims, and it's very subtle, and it does not reinforce it with color very much. But as the movie starts to climax, it begins to slowly subvert the naturalization and better exemplify these differences through color. Initially in the film, the park's home feels kind of just aspirational because it's so warm and light and clean and simple, and the Kim's apartment is very dark, very cluttered, claustrophobic, small, no natural light, and it just very much embodies the struggles of the working class in Korea. And this contrast, while it is pretty subtle, it just immerses the viewer in this world where the divisions feel completely inevitable, and they very much align with Bowdry's critique of films being so ideological. And once the climax approaches, this whole dynamic of the class difference being completely natural is a little bit shattered, and it disrupts the pristine harmony of the park's home because there's blood everywhere, people are dying, being stabbed, there's just so much violence, and that is kind of a representation of the collapse of class hierarchy. So this is the final scene I'm going to show to exemplify my theory. It is the last scene of Parasite, and it very harshly contrasts the shocking and awful reality that the Kims are now living in with what he, I can't remember his name, but with what he is imagining and with what his plan is, which is to buy the park's home eventually so that his father can be free of the bunker. Here we see very bright, warm tones. Nature, now he is being associated with nature because he is represented as being a wealthy, successful individual in Korean society. His father walks from the cold depths of the bunker to the warmth and welcoming invitation that is the wealthy house. And the lighting and the colors represent this perfectly. Once again, illustrating the stark difference between the working class and the wealthy class through color. But now you're thrown back to the cold reality, which is that he has not bought the house yet, and his father is still trapped in the bunker, and they're hopeless, filled with despair. There does not seem a way to move forward. All they have is their dreams, really. So that's all I have. Another great film that exemplifies this is Cruella, and I was going to go more into that, but this is long enough at this point that I think it would just be redundant. But there's lots of great showcases of Estella's early life when she's poor as to when she becomes Cruella and she's more successful and wealthy. And I'm just going to leave it at that. But I hope you enjoyed. I hope this all made sense, and I hope I communicated it clearly enough to understand. And thanks for watching. Last thing, these are the sources I used outside of class notes. This one, this one, this one, this one, this one, and I guess you could count this as well.